Next comes an intermission in proceedings, and it represents a transition in the focus of the book.
Then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, surrounded by a cloud, with a rainbow over his head. His face shone like the sun, and his feet were like pillars of fire. And in his hand was a small scroll that had been opened. He stood with his right foot on the sea, and his left foot on the land. And he gave a great shout like the roar of a lion. And when he shouted, the seven thunders answered. When the seven thunders spoke, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Keep secret what the seven thunders said, and do not write it down." This is an unusual passage in the sense that Revelation is meant to reveal, and yet John is not allowed to write down or tell us exactly what the seven thunders said. What was the point of showing John this part of the vision if he was not allowed to relay it to us? What was the point of John even including this in his report? Well, if nothing else, this verse tells us again that Revelation is progressive. There are things that are sealed up and that can't be known today. They will become evident nearer the time, certainly, but not today.
It would be pointless at this juncture to try and speculate on what the seven thunders said. God clearly doesn't want it to be known yet. And while it's good for us to be curious about prophecy generally and to discern the signs of the times, it's useless trying to reveal things that God has deliberately kept hidden. They will become apparent in due course and in His own time.
This is also why we shouldn't bother trying to set dates for when Jesus Christ will return. He has already said that it can't be known in advance. I believe this event is included in the timeline and God showed it to John because God just wants us to know that something important will happen here. Something significant will happen around the sixth trumpet. People will know it when they see it. And since God always sends His prophets along ahead of time to reveal to the people what He's about to do, God will probably send a prophet along ahead of the enactment of the seven thunders at the right time. Perhaps He will send two prophets. And we'll expand on that theory later. John continues, "Then the angel I saw standing on the sea and on the land raised his right hand toward heaven. He swore an oath in the name of the one who lives forever and ever, who created the heavens and everything in them, the earth and everything in it, and the sea and everything in it. He said, 'There will be no more delay. When the seventh angel blows his trumpet, God's mysterious plan will be fulfilled. It will happen just as He announced it to His servants, the prophets.'" Here the angel confirms that there is only one more trumpet to go, and when it is blown, all things will be fulfilled. The pouring out of God's wrath on the earth will be complete. The angel's stance with one foot on the sea and one on the land denotes an authority over all the earth. Then the voice from heaven spoke to me again, "Go and take the open scroll from the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and on the land." So I went to the angel and told him to give me the small scroll. "Yes, take it and eat it," he said. "It will be as sweet as honey in your mouth, but it will turn sour in your stomach." So I took the small scroll from the hand of the angel and I ate it. It was sweet in my mouth, but when I swallowed it, it turned sour in my stomach. Then I was told, "You must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, languages, and kings." John may have been denied the opportunity to write down what the thunders had said, but instead he's given another message on a small scroll.
Some people make the mistake of thinking that the words of the seven thunders are written on the small scroll, but the two are unconnected. Indeed, while John is told that the words of the seven thunders are to be kept secret or sealed up until a later date, the prophecy on the small scroll is an open one.
John says, "In his hand was a small scroll that had been opened." And John is told, "Go and take the open scroll from the hand of the angel." There are no seals here, so unlike the seven thunders, this message isn't hidden or secret. What is the significance of this small scroll then, and why is it small?
It's small because the focus of Revelation is now zeroing in on Israel, but even more specifically, on Jerusalem.
It's a mini judgment for God's holy city within the larger judgment of the day of wrath. Indeed, most of Revelation from now on will be focused there. Remember how I said that Revelation was like Acts in reverse? Acts starts in Jerusalem and then the focus spreads out to Israel, and then around chapter 9, Israel is left behind completely and the focus expands to the wider Gentile church. Well, just as Acts expands, Revelation contracts. Revelation starts with the wider Gentile church, then shifts focus to Israel, and now more specifically, focuses narrowly on Jerusalem again. The center of end-time prophecy is there. Almost the entire second half of the book of Revelation is devoted to the fate of Jerusalem. Why should God spend so much time focused on Jerusalem? Because as Zechariah 2:8 tells us, Jerusalem is God's most precious possession. You'll notice that when the Old Testament prophets speak about the end, they focus on Jerusalem's fate too. Why does John eat this small scroll? You may remember Ezekiel doing the same thing, and just like then, John eating the small scroll is symbolic of the fact that God is giving him another prophecy to declare. It's a bit like the word is being downloaded into him. He's digesting it and it's becoming a part of him. The words he writes will not be his own. Why does it taste sweet like honey? Because as Psalm 119:103 says, the word of God is sweeter than honey. However, the scroll prophetically contains more pronouncements of judgment, which is why it turns sour in his stomach. It's sweet because it's the righteous word of God, but sour because it spells disaster for the world. But again, far more specifically, for Israel and its beating heart, Jerusalem. Indeed, this marks the start of a period called Jacob's trouble. Jeremiah prophesied about this time of trouble for Israel, saying, "In all history there has never been such a time of terror. It will be a time of trouble for my people Jacob," or Israel. "Yet in the end they will be saved." Jacob's trouble is also mentioned by Jesus in the Olivet Discourse. "And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you will know that the time of its destruction has arrived. Then those in Judea must flee to the hills, those in Jerusalem must get out, and those out in the country should not return to the city. For those will be days of God's vengeance, and the prophetic words of the Scriptures will be fulfilled. How terrible it will be for pregnant women and for nursing mothers in those days! For there will be disaster in the land, and great anger against this people. They will be killed by the sword or sent away as captives to all the nations of the world, and Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the period of the Gentiles comes to an end." Why is God specifically pouring out his wrath on Israel, Jerusalem even, his holy city? Because they still have an unpaid debt. There is still some unfinished business between God and his people. As Jesus says, the prophetic words of the Scriptures must be fulfilled. What prophetic words are these? Well, back in Daniel's time, around 535 BC, Israel had been invaded and taken captive by the Babylonians. This in itself was punishment for disobedience. While in captivity in Babylon, Daniel was praying for God to forgive his nation and to let them return to their own land. He says, "I went on praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people, pleading with the Lord my God for Jerusalem, his holy mountain. As I was praying, Gabriel, whom I had seen in the earlier vision, came swiftly to me at the time of the evening sacrifice. He explained to me, 'Daniel, I have come here to give you insight and understanding. The moment you began praying, a command was given, and now I am here to tell you what it was, for you are very precious to God. Listen carefully so that you can understand the meaning of your vision. A period of 70 sets of 7 has been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish their rebellion, to put an end to their sin, to atone for their guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to confirm the prophetic vision, and to anoint the most holy place.' 70 sets of 7 is 490 years. This was the length of sentence that God had decreed for his people to atone for their rebellion and guilt. And note what it says, that when that time was finished, it would bring in everlasting righteousness. But this time period would be broken up into segments. Gabriel continues, 'Now listen and understand. 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7 will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem until a ruler, the Anointed One, comes. Jerusalem will be rebuilt with streets and strong defenses despite the perilous times.' Gabriel says that from the moment the Babylonian king allows them to return from slavery and the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem, there would be 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7. That is 49 years plus 434 years, which is 483 years altogether. After those 483 years had passed, the Anointed One would come. This, of course, is a reference to Jesus Christ, the Messiah. The calculations are complicated due to the fact that the Jewish calendar is lunar rather than solar, and has 360 days in a year rather than 365, and that's not to mention the issue of leap years. However, we can simplify it a little if we understand that 483 Jewish years represents 173,880 days. Since the command to rebuild Jerusalem after their Babylonian captivity was given by King Artaxerxes on March the 16th, 445 BC, all we have to do is add 173,880 days to that date, and we should arrive at the coming of Jesus. Incredibly, 173,880 days after March 16th, 445 BC, is April the 6th, 32 AD, the exact date that Jesus is believed to have made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The 3rd chapter of Luke tells us that Jesus started his ministry in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, that's 29 AD, and we know that Jesus ministered for 3 years until the 4th Passover. That brings us up to the Passover of 32 AD. The prophecy was fulfilled down to the day. The Anointed One arrived right on cue. However, Israel didn't recognize their Messiah at this point and rejected him. So it was at this exact moment that Israel had their eyes blinded and their hearts hardened, so that all things might be fulfilled according to God's plan. In other words, he had to be crucified for the sins of the world. Therefore, it was at this exact same moment when Christ was offered to the Gentiles instead, and the church age began. In other words, after 483 years, the clock stopped ticking on Israel's 490-year sentence. There was a break in the countdown while God's primary relationship switched from Israel to the church. That means that there is still one set of 7 years left where God has to turn his attention back to Israel so that all prophecy can be fulfilled and the fullness of their sentence can be completed. They still have a 7-year debt to pay. And that 7-year time period will begin from the moment the church age ends, or the age of the Gentiles ends. When did the church age end? We noted that the church age ended back around the 6th or 7th seal. That's when the church seems to fade away from view and God returns his attention back to Israel, signified by the sealing of the 144,000. This final 7-year period that wraps up human history and ushers in eternal righteousness is sometimes called Daniel's 70th week. The angel Gabriel continues, "After this period of 62 sets of 7, the Anointed One will be killed, appearing to have accomplished nothing, and a ruler will arise whose army will destroy the city and the temple. The end will come with a flood and war, and its miseries are decreed from that time to the very end. The ruler will make a treaty with the people for a period of 1 set of 7, but after half this time he will put an end to the sacrifices and offerings, and as a climax to all his terrible deeds he will set up a sacrilegious object that causes desecration, until the fate decreed for this defiler is finally poured out on him." Gabriel says that the Anointed One, Jesus, would die, appearing to have accomplished nothing, at least in their eyes. You see, Israel expected their Messiah to come as a conquering warrior who would establish the nation, crush their enemies, and rule the world. Clearly, they didn't expect a suffering Messiah who would be flogged, crucified, and buried in a borrowed tomb. Yet, if they had understood this prophecy and many others from the Old Testament, they would have known that this had to happen. Jesus came to die for sinners. This prophecy then goes on to say that when the clock starts ticking on the final 7-year stretch of their judgment, it would begin with a ruler making a peace treaty with them. However, halfway through that 7-year treaty, that is after 3.5 years, 42 months, or 1,260 days, he will break it to attack Jerusalem. At that time there will be a war and a flood, and he will set up a sacrilegious idol to glorify himself on Temple Mount. This idol is often referred to as the abomination of desolation. Its presence on Temple Mount will indicate the subjugation and desolation of the city. This ruler, who we can identify as the Antichrist, will have authority to do whatever he likes for the second half of that 7-year period. And what he likes, unfortunately, is to wage war on the people of Israel. Hence the term Jacob's trouble, or Israel's trouble. So, although Jacob's trouble will last for 3.5 years from around the 6th trumpet, the Antichrist will actually have been on the scene for at least 3.5 years prior. And although we can only guess as to when his rise to prominence will be, it would make sense if the peace treaty with Israel was signed around the time that the church age ends, back around the 6th or 7th seal. This will be when God's primary relationship switches away from the church back to Israel, and would set Daniel's 70th week in motion. He won't be revealed as the Antichrist at that early stage. He will be considered a man of peace. Indeed, people will laud him for his ability to finally bring some stability to that Middle Eastern region. Remember, Paul wrote, "When people are saying everything is peaceful and secure, then disaster will fall on them as suddenly as a pregnant woman's labor pains begin, and there will be no escape." Israel will have been lulled into a false sense of security at the time of the attack. The Antichrist's true nature will only be revealed halfway into the 7-year peace treaty, when he will turn violent. That pivotal moment seems to coincide with the 200 million strong army killing 1/3 of the world. Having orchestrated that, he will then surround Jerusalem, looking to invade it and take control, and indeed he will be allowed to trample on the city for another 3.5 years. There are hints of Islam in this scenario again. Muhammad began as a man of peace while living in Mecca, but then infamously turned into a bloodthirsty warlord after moving to Medina. This may not be a coincidental parallel. Also, Muslims use the word hudna for peace treaties, and in reality, hudnas are not worth the paper they're written on, believing as they do that they can be legitimately broken at any moment, and that they can even be used to deceive the enemy by lulling them into a false sense of security. The Antichrist peace treaty bears the hallmarks of a hudna.
Above all, though, it's important to remember that God is allowing this to happen. Although it will seem like the Antichrist is in control as he runs amok over Israel and tears up Jerusalem, ultimately God is still omnipotent. He's merely allowing this to happen so that Israel's sentence can be completed and their guilt atoned for. God has done this in the past by letting surrounding nations invade to take his people captive for a time, and he will do it again, but God is always in control.